Dear McAnally, please.
Is Russia too powerful, unpredictable and scary for Europe to deal with it in the way that it's dealt with other countries in the past?
Is Russia too unpredictable, big and scary to be dealt with in the way that Europe has dealt with other countries? Michael Heseltine.
You can't possibly underestimate the risks and dangers in the Ukraine in recent events. It's unpredictable, and if there's one thing that is necessary, it is to lower the temperature and to try and resolve this matter by dialogue. I don't think anyone knows how it will be resolved. How can I, as I'm not Ukrainian, I've never been there, how can I know how the thing will play out? But there is one thought that I would contribute to the answer to this question. I think that in the West, we need to reappraise our relationships with Russia. You see, if I look forward over the next 20, 30 years, the big problems, dangers I see for our part of the world, let's assume China were to become a belligerent world power. I don't think it will, but suppose it was. I would want Russia on our side. If you look at the southern borders of Russia, they are full of unstable, very ethnically divided countries, endless difficulties. And surely we ought to have a degree of humility with the idea that military intervention or something of that sort is going to solve anything. If you take Iraq, Afghanistan, you take Libya, it's quite obvious that there are potential civil wars going on in those countries which our intervention has done nothing to solve. Russian intervention, however illegal, however questionable, in the Ukraine, has actually created a position where bloodshed is not likely to flow within the country itself. And so I am frightened of the language which tries to push Russia ever more remote, with bits of the Ukraine being attracted into the European Union, other bits of the Ukraine wanting to join the Russia itself. You saw the result of the Ukrainian parliament today. And the diplomacy, I think, for the West, for Europe particularly, is to reach out to Russia for some all-embracing, almost certainly economic settlement, which makes Russia feel secure. Never forget.
Whose language are you objecting to?
Well, I think that the reaction of the Americans today of sanctions of the sort that they've imposed now is presumptuous.
And the British government?
The British government is involved in European talks. But the last point I wanted to make about Russians, never forget that it was Napoleon who came from France and Hitler who came from Germany. And every Russian knows that.
David Aaronovitch.
That would be a completely appropriate response if anybody had even remotely suggested invading Russia. Nobody has. But let's just think about how the game's changed today. And remember before, as we do, that we stand guarantors under a 1994 agreement to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And that means plus the Crimea. Today, the coup people who took over in the Crimea, when people stormed the parliament there, brought forward a referendum that was supposed to be that they themselves had said would be held on autonomy for Crimea on the 30th of March to the 16th of March, 10 days away from now. On the same day, two Ukrainian TV stations were closed down and two pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin TV stations opened up in their stead.
That's a description, but the question is Russia too big and scary to be dealt with in the way that Europe deals with other issues?
It certainly is far too big and scary to be dealt with in the way that Lord Heseltine is suggesting, for this reason. The leader of the Crimean pro-Russian group said, when he was asked what he expected to happen as a result of this referendum, was 75% will vote yes. This is a de facto annexation of the territory of a sovereign country with the agreement and with the connivance of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, that we stand guarantor to the state having suggested that we would stop it somehow from happening. Now, we can't solve this by invasion, but we certainly, sure as hell, have a responsibility to the Ukrainians not to turn around and say, well, in some 100 years' time, we might need you against the Chinese, so we're going to turn a blind eye to the fact that you've gone in and taken a big chunk of somebody else's country. Now, actually, I do have some thoughts about how it should be dealt with, and Ed Miliband and David Cameron have talked about some. We can talk about some of them later. But the one thing that we're not going to be able to do is simply say, oh, Vladimir Putin, you know, well, you're a Russian, this is what we expect from Russians, and we don't care that much, we're just going to let it happen.
Yeah,
Alexander Nekrasov. Well, you can come back on what you're saying. Alexander Nekrasov.
Well, let's turn this question around. Can Russia trust the West? Now, when the Cold War stopped, we Russians, well, our government, was assured by the West it's not going to push NATO border to the east. We were assured definitely. Look what happened afterwards. NATO started to spread closer and closer to Russia. And this was not a sort of a friendly intent. Why? If the Cold War was over, NATO wanted to be closer to Russia. We don't understand that. Secondly, we are missing the point here, that it was a coup in Kiev which was supported by the EU. And let's not close our eyes to that, because EU politicians involved themselves in the so-called protests. They came over, they encouraged those protests. Now we know they were funded by the EU and the Americans. So to say that President Putin suddenly decided to invade Crimea for no reason...
Alexander, are you saying that Europe organised those protests and Europe effectively led to the downfall of the corrupt President Yanukovych?
No, excuse me. He was a democratically elected president, and that was confirmed by the European Union observers and other observers, right?
Of course.
So to say that he was a corrupt... I can name you several more countries.
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you come from one.
Yes, and I can even say to you that President Hollande is less popular than Yanukovych was. But we're not saying, oh, come on, French people, get rid of him. The point here is this. When Ukraine refused to sign a free association agreement with the EU, which was a bad agreement, believe me, I read it. Any sane government would have said no to this agreement. The Russian deal was better. There was money on the table. Excuse me, but there was money on the table, because Ukraine would not have survived with 800 million euros, which was promised by the EU, right? And suddenly, Yanukovych, in a matter of days, became illegal, corrupt, and everything. Before the signing of that agreement, before it was still on the table, he was okay for the European Union. He was okay.
All right. We get the point. You, sir, in the second row. We'll come back to the argument. Yes.
I really do think Alexander's got a point. Can Russia trust the West? Because the way I sort of see it is, I know I ain't condone what Russia's done at all in this situation, but where are the West getting this presumption we have the right to sanction Russia for breaching international law when we participated in an illegal invasion of Iraq?
All right, Amanda Patel. Hold on, David. Amanda Patel. You heard the point he made. How can Russia trust the West?
And I totally agree with you. I think that Tony Blair's legacy was that we have lost the moral authority to go into other countries. You look at the mess in Afghanistan, the mess in Iraq, and the last thing, I actually think David Cameron has judged this right. We do not want to see another British soldier, man or woman, with their boots on foreign soils trying to sort out someone else's problems and coming up back with their legs together. And if I just may answer, was it Eddie with the original question? You know, the thing that struck me about this whole dilemma at the moment, we have just announced that our defence budget has been so cut that it's unlikely we could defend our own country. Germany's has been cut, France's has been cut, and America announced last week that they will now have, in their next plan, they'll have fewer troops than they had in pre-Second World War. How can we stand up to countries like Russia, who've increased their budgets, and they've just announced that they've got one of these big missiles that can, nuke us? You know, it's like an ant biting on an alligator.
So what should you do? Nothing.
I think what David Cameron is doing is absolutely right. He's trying to negotiate his way out of it. He's trying to bring, you know, a qualified conversation between Russia and the Ukraine and the people there, and not threaten them with violence from Europe, which is the last thing they need.
You said in the centre there.
Some very interesting points raised there. One concern I think that we need to establish even beyond this current crisis is that probably the two most damaging events of the last century were the two world wars. And NATO's agreements itself create the same kind of crises that permitted the First World War. You know, the Serbs killed Franz Ferdinand. There was all these cross agreements that enabled the First World War. And where we sit right now, the Ukraine was inches from signing an agreement where it became part of NATO and where we would therefore have been forced into a situation that would be extremely damaging. And I think we just need to...
Sorry, there are some extraordinary things going on here. Firstly, no one has suggested any use of military force against Russia. That would be completely mad. Secondly, nobody's suggesting Ukraine comes into NATO. The EU agreement was an association agreement with the European Union, which, incidentally, as far as we can tell, the majority of Ukrainian people actually seem to have wanted, but which the President, after discussions with President Putin, I wonder what went on there, actually decided at the last moment that he wasn't going to sign and set off the crisis. The EU didn't set off the crisis, Yanukovych set off the crisis, and Putin is now trying to take advantage of it.
Excuse me, David, but let me tell you about the conversation between Catherine Ashton and the Estonian foreign minister.
The European foreign minister.
The Estonian foreign minister, who told her that the information points to those snipers who were shooting.
No, he didn't say that.
No, he did say that. It was confirmed. Actually, let me finish. This was confirmed by the Estonian foreign ministry.
No,
so
he didn't confirm that.
Sorry, just make clear what it is you're asserting.
No, the point is this. Suddenly we learn that the snipers who were shooting both at the police and the protesters were hired by the opposition.
No, we didn't.
No, yes, it did.
No, we did
not.
No,
excuse me, you should read the text.
This is completely...
No, this is very important, because that betrays...
Look, it's no use getting into the minutiae, who said what, who shot what. Exactly. This is a vitally important political issue of massive scale. And where I take issue with David, he says we've guaranteed this frontier. Now, that's terrific. We can all march to the banners, but actually you can't do anything. And so you're deceiving your audience.
I think you were in that government, Michael. I think you were in the Conservative government that made that guarantee.
This whole issue is full of quotations of who said what. The issue is this. The Russians are there, and we, you say, have guaranteed the frontier. I don't disagree with you. What are you going to do about it? You're not going to send troops. You've made that absolutely clear. Are you going to have economic sanctions?
Yes.
There's no chance. There is no chance of the Germans agreeing to economic sanctions because they will suffer more than the Russians, because they depend on Russia for their energy supply.
All right. Yes, sir. Yes.
Personally, I think the UK needs to wake up a little here. You know, we need to play our role on a global scale as toning down the rhetoric from the US, bridge the gap between the US and the EU and Russia.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bigger picture going on here.
Right.
Not only are we disagreeing about Ukraine, but while the Syrian conflict goes on, and let's bear in mind that Russia supports President Assad, there's already an element of distrust there. We need to play a more mediator or mediatorial role in this. You know, we need to open the talks. We need to get Russia back on side. You know, I don't agree with what they've done, but, you know, we can't go wading into this pretending we're a big authority on it. We're not, and we rely on the gas from Russia.
What would your view be if they have this vote in Crimea and it votes to go with Russia and leave Ukraine?
If it can be overseen and properly, well, if it can be, and if they allow the EU in to make sure that the vote is fair, and that's the way they vote.
All right, then it would be a closed issue for you. You say at the back in the second row. I'll come to you, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with David Aaronovitch there. I mean, where is the moral imperative to this, you know? I mean, when are we going to stand up for a country that wants democracy? I mean, is this not akin to Germany going into Poland, you know, the first steps of that? And is not the actions of Vladimir Putin just totalitarian and dictatorial?
But
all of what he's done is unjust. Does anybody care about that any longer?
When you talk about the morality, what do you think's happening in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya, all of which were used to justify the argument we will set up stable democratic governments? Look at what's happening there.
All right. Rachel Reeves. Hang on. You can come back at her, but let Rachel Reeves answer your point.
Yeah. Well, actually, going back to the first question as well from Eddie, look, I think that there is common ground that can be found, and others have said this already, but I think it is worth repeating. We need to lower the temperature to de-escalate and get the Ukrainians and the Russians talking to each other, because that's the only way we're going to find a solution. Of course, there's a role for Britain and the EU and America, but there's only really going to be an answer if the Ukrainians and Russians talk to each other.
That's correct.
Now, there are, of course, things we can do, and no one is suggesting military action. And, you know, that sort of language, I think, is sabre-rattling. It's not going to help anybody. But there are targeted things that can be done. For example, visa restrictions, asset freezing. I'm not suggesting that they need to be done right now, but there are options on the table which are short of sanctions and certainly short of military action. And I do think that common ground can be found, but we need that common ground to be found.
It feels like it's not the first time Russia's done it, and it might be Ukraine now, but it might be another one of the former USSR states in another 10 years. And the last time that they did go into one of the former countries, they devastated it. They really, really did. So when are we going to actually turn around and start helping these people who are asking for help and stop helping people who aren't wanting help?
And the best way to help is to get people sat around the table with each other, which is not happening now, and there's an important role for Britain and the EU.
Does that work for you?
Well, they didn't listen the first time round.
It's the only thing that.
All right. What do you think? I'm sorry, I said I'd come back to you.
Yeah, sorry, I agree with Rachel Reeves and a lot of people. There needs to be dialogue and a way forward. But even though I have a lot of respect for you, Michael Heseltine, you know, I get tired of this thing about Iraq and Afghanistan being wheeled out as examples of how the West has meddled in other countries' affairs. These are very different scenarios. You know, there are a lot of precedents about this, agreements that were made before, the fact that NATO, all these countries around are part of NATO. If a country wants democracy, you know, it should be upheld by countries like this.
OK, Simon Hughes, do you want to answer that point?
It should be upheld by countries like this, but can I link that with the initial question? Is Russia big? Yes. Is it unpredictable? Yes, in some respects, in terms of how it pursues its ambitions. And is it scary? Certainly when its troops, pretending not to be its troops, appear in other countries, that's pretty scary. But we have to be a bit careful. In my constituency, just by the Imperial War Museum, there is a memorial to the Soviet war dead at the end of the Second World War. 25 million people. They were our allies. Without them, we would not have won the Second World War. The Arctic convoys, who we salute, were part of that wonderful rescue operation. It is ironic in a way that it was in Crimea, in Yalta, where the settlement post-war was resolved in 1945.
Where does this get us with today?
Well, where it gets us is that we have to be sensitive to Russian history while we absolutely uphold the right of the Ukrainian people to their independence, to their own decision-making. And Alexander's wrong about what happened in the last few weeks. There was a deal done for a coalition agreement. The president then left within 24 hours. The parliament decided what should happen. The parliament elected an interim president. And Dave is absolutely right. There is a guarantee of which we're signatories that Ukraine should not be invaded. We're signatories of that in return for them giving up nuclear weapons. And there's an absolute guarantee that Crimea is part of Ukraine. We need, as Rachel says, and there's a consensus across Parliament among the major parties, to encourage European Union to work together. We have slightly different interests, but we must work together. We have to use those appropriate sanctions and methods which are political and which give the message to Russia. But if the Ukrainians, I've been there several times, and I love the country and the people, if the Ukrainians can't look to us at moments like this to stand up for the liberties, to determine their own future, then we're not just denying our obligation to them in law, we're actually failing to stand up for standards that should be European and that Russia needs to respect as well.
But if the Crimea... If Crimea chooses to leave Ukraine, then there's nothing you can do about it, despite these agreements and guarantees and all these things.
Hang on a minute. It's slightly more complicated. Ukraine has done this before. There's been a vote since 1954 when Crimea was given to Ukraine. There's already been one occasion when there was a vote by the a referendum, a so-called referendum.
No, Simon, there was never a referendum.
There
Sorry.
was.
No, you can't say that. No, there was never a referendum.
I do say that, and I'm also clear that the Parliament in Crimea has made decisions, as it were, to break away. I think the issue is not now whether we allow suddenly, in the middle of all this turmoil, Crimea to break away. We need to, as Rachel rightly said, seek to get the Russians and the Ukrainians around the table. 30% of people in Ukraine are Russian-speaking, first language. They need to come around the table, supported by the rest of the European Union. Can I just say one last thing? The economic future of Russia, as well as Ukraine, depends on a peaceful outcome. Russia's economy is not in good nick. Ukraine's economy is not in good nick. They could be very strong economically. They could help themselves and us. But we absolutely are going the wrong way if we allow things to go on as they are.
We've got hands up, and we've had a lot of talk about what the EU and Britain might do economically, sanctions and all that. So I want to take a question from Swamit Mehta, please, on this point, and we'll just carry on with this because it's very, very interesting.
I question how credible the threats of economic sanctions on Russia actually are, given that it supplies 30% of Europe's gas.
It's a point that Michael Heseltine made. But how credible are the threats of sanctions, or indeed of any action, David?
Firstly, Russia is a great deal more open to economic sanctions than, say, the Soviet Union was. I mean, all these arguments used to be deployed at the time of the Soviet Union, so you couldn't do anything about Hungary or Czechoslovakia. And it was true, because Russia was not part of the world economy. Now it is. And actually, it's a pretty vulnerable part of the world economy. That's why its oligarchs come and live over here, buy our football clubs, buy up large sections of London, etc., use this place as a place to launder money, large amounts of it that was stolen in Russia, effectively by stealing the assets of the Russian people. And the question is whether we are going to be effectively corrupted by that money into saying that we're not prepared to take any kind of economic hit, should in 10 days' time, this is the point, in 10 days' time that rigged vote will happen, and in 10 days' time, effectively, there will be a de facto annexation of Crimea, unless we show in these next 10 days that we are prepared to do something about it. I agree about the business about talking people down and getting people to talk, but it can't be on the basis that effectively we say, yeah, we're happy with the annexation.
Michael Heseltine.
I would never say I was happy. I just listened to hear what you think we should do. And we're not going to impose sanctions on Russia because we won't get agreement to do it. And what no one is talking about is whether sanctions on Russia might lead to sanctions on us from Russia and the cost in British economic terms that would flow from that.
If we could get agreement, Michael, would you be in favour of it?
If we could get agreement...
With European partners?
With European partners to talk to Russia and the Ukraine, yes. But what I would not do is to rush to the point at which Russia is forced onto the defensive. You know, I think you said it, or the question earlier, are they unpredictable? They're not unpredictable. These are the most sophisticated chess players in the world. And what they do is to back their own self-interests vehemently. But they calculate. And I remember vividly as Defence Secretary facing the dangers of nuclear holocaust. The only real danger was a mistake. The Russians would never have precipitated a nuclear war, because they could never have won such a war.
OK, you said in the fourth row.
I just think that it's very telling that when there are economic interests of the EU and of America and of Russia involved, that the whole international community is absolutely concerned. When it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, who has seen a massive crisis in terms of workers' protests and government attacking those protesters and police attacking those protesters, the international community has been silent, completely silent. I think it's atrocious.
But are you saying economic interest, self-interest?
Self-interest, completely, yeah.
Amanda Patel, you'd agree with that?
Well, I can't see in a million years that we're going to implement any sanctions in this situation when we have to get the agreement of Germany, when they rely upon 40% of their energy from Russia. It's just not going to happen. There's not going to be an agreement.
Next week.
And, sorry?
It will happen next week, Amanda.
What will happen?
If the Russian and the pro-Russians in Crimea insist on going ahead with this referendum and rig it, there will be economic sanctions of some kind or another, because we will have no alternative.
David, you use the word "and rig it." Now, can I ask you a simple question? 81 out of the 83 members of the Crimean Parliament today voted for such a referendum. How can you say with certainty that it will be rigged? Or is that what you want to say after it happens?
No, I can't say. I can't say with certainty.
But you did say.
I can't say with 100% certainty.
You did say.
I can say with 95% likelihood.
Well, come off it.
No, that it's going to be rigged. Well, that's not good enough for you.
Simon Hughes, you're in the government. You're the only person here who is in the government. What do you make of that bit of paper we saw being carried in or out of Downing Street saying, actually, we're not going to do anything at all?
Well, firstly, I don't think everybody saw the whole of the bit of paper, as I understand it.
Oh, did you see more than we saw?
No, but I've, as you would hope, taken advice as to what is being discussed. The reality is...
and you've taken advice on what was on that bit of paper?
No, I've talked to colleagues, obviously, to know what exactly...
What did it say?
Well, no, I don't... Given that it isn't a definitive position of the UK government, I don't think exactly what it said is helpful. The UK government has a very clear position set out by the Prime Minister today and yesterday and the day before, actually with the support of the Leader of the Opposition, and that is that we are taking action because to do nothing is unacceptable. And to respond to the questioner, they are intended to start with be targeted asset-related action to deal with people who've got money in this country who we can freeze and deal with in very targeted ways. Now, there are other things we can do. We've already said we're not proceeding with the preparations for the G8 summit, which is due to be in Russia, because they hold the chair. We've already said we're not going to support, sadly, from a political assessment, the Paralympics. Those are those sort of things. And can I just say to the gentleman who raised the question about Bosnia-Herzegovina, I had the privilege to be there 2 weeks ago. We absolutely have made clear to the government in that country that it's unacceptable for the authorities to turn on the public. I did so myself to the Prime Minister of the country on behalf of Her Majesty's government. We absolutely make clear to all countries in Europe, whatever the relationship inside or outside the EU, that, for example, oppression of minorities like gay people is unacceptable. We will go on doing that, but at the moment we need to concentrate on a collective agreement across the European Union with all our differences to try to make sure we have a common approach to say to Russia, stop, think, it's not in your interest, and it's certainly not in the interest of Ukraine.
And actually, we have done something. We have withdrawn Prince Edward's appearance at the Sochi Olympic Games. So we've come out fighting.
Can't work out whether that's a Republican or a monarchist opinion that you're about as an Australian. Or perhaps you aren't an Australian anymore. Look, you can join in this debate, of course, at home.